everyone. Welcome back. Thank you for sticking with us. Our next presenter is Melissa Murrell. If you were here yesterday, she also did the presentation yesterday on demographics in Alabama with Carlos Torres. And today she is here to speak about language access, and specifically providing language services for people with limited English proficiency. So I adore Melissa. She is my boss and I've worked with her for a while now, but I will let her introduce herself and tell you more about her background before she starts off her presentation.
Good morning, everyone. I, again, just want to thank you for being here. Hold on one second. Just trying to deal with the back end thing here. So I, as you probably know, if you were here yesterday, am the Director of Capacity Building Initiatives at AshaKiran. I have been an interpreter and translator in the state of Alabama for over 10 years and have worked a lot in a number of different sectors on language access, which is really my passion. And for those of you who know AshaKiran and maybe know me, you weren't going to get out of this conference without talking about language access, because when we deal with any foreign-born client and specifically with the Latino community, we do have, as we've mentioned before, quite a number of people who don't speak English at all or speak limited English. And so if you've been in on any of our presentations in the past regarding language access, some of this may be a repetition, but I think it doesn't hurt to get some of the background. I will say that in Alabama, language access is a struggle, right? And if you have worked on this issue, or if you have worked with people who have limited English proficiency, you know that, right? We are way behind in the state, and there's a lot of work to do in terms of advocating for our clients who are limited English proficient. So I just wanted to give that framework first. There are a number of people in the world of interpreters and translators who have been working for many years on this issue. We now have an Alabama Language Access Coalition, which AshaKiran is a partner on. And we will be providing more information to everybody about that project in the next couple of months. We've really just started it going. So I do want to, at the beginning, just mention that if anyone as an individual or as an organization is interested in this issue, we would love to have you involved. So please reach out to us, and I will give you some more information at the end of and y'all, I apologize. I'm in an office that has an automatic light. So if it goes off, please forgive me. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen. And so today what we're going to be talking about is advocating for limited English proficient clients. Give me just one second. Oh, y'all. I can never do this. Having a screen sharing issue. Okay, one second. Give me about 1 minute to fix
Melissa, this is Rebecca speaking.
Yes.
We need, I think we need to develop just a slide that says technical difficulties. Because that's just the story of Zoom conferences these days. And how that
So
always goes.
we're okay. So I guess the technical difficulty here is once I share my screen, it blocks the menu at the top of the PowerPoint, if anybody's ever had that issue before. So give me just 1 second. Okay. Now we got it. Can everybody see this? Okay, good. So today we're going to do a review of language access, some language access laws. So y'all have some of the basics of why and how to advocate for limited English proficient clients. So, I think sometimes if we don't have that background, we don't have an idea of really how to approach this issue. So I do want to just give you some basics first. And we start with this idea of language access. What do we even mean when we talk about language access? The essential definition of that is that you want to put somebody on the same level as someone who speaks proficient English. So how do you do that? You use language services to bridge that communication barrier with people who may not be able to speak, understand, read, or write fluently in the dominant language, which in our case is English. We talk about spoken language and sign language interpreters, which I'm really excited to say we have both on this conference today. But basically, those folks do similar jobs in different languages, right? We also talk about written language services. And so those are the tools that you would use to look at language access. We use interpreters and we use translators to provide language services. So who can tell me what the difference is? And I will say, I'm just having Zoom issues today, but I cannot see the chat. So Rebecca, if you would just read out any comments in the chat for me.
No problem, Melissa.
What's the difference between an interpreter and a translator? And I will say, AshaKiran employees don't get to answer this question.
Well, Misty already knocked it out of the park. She said translation is written, interpreting is verbal.
Awesome. So I'm guessing Misty might have been in one of our previous trainings and she has used our language services as well. So thank you for that. Yes, that is the simple definition. If you're having a conversation, interpreter is the person you're going to use. If you're dealing with a document or any written language, then you are dealing with a translator. Some people do both. Some people just do one or the other. They are two very different skills. So who are we even talking about when we talk about language access? The term that you are going to hear me use 100 times today is limited English proficient. So we use that term on sort of a higher level, right? This is not a term that I call people every day, right? When we're dealing with somebody who has limited English proficiency. But it's something we use internally to refer to someone. And as interpreters, we may refer to the LEP, right? And that's just a shorthand to say, this is the person we're serving, right? So LEP people are people who do not speak English as their primary language, and they may have a limited ability to read, write, speak, or understand English. And the key to that is that people may be able to communicate in one setting, but not in another more complicated or stressful situation. So they may be able to go to the grocery store and communicate with the cashier. They may be able to even make an appointment or greet you or have a really basic conversation. But once you get into something more complicated, then it may be difficult for them to understand and communicate. And I will say it's very common. If you have ever learned another language, you may relate to this, but it's very common to have someone who understands but is not able to articulate themselves well. So it may be a situation where it seems like they're understanding and able to communicate, but that ability to verbalize what they're thinking is difficult. And I will say, the more stress, the more crisis you deal with, if you have somebody who is dealing with a traumatic situation, it becomes more difficult and really, and it takes a lot of energy and a lot of brain power to work and talk in a language that isn't your primary language. So many people in a stressful situation will really revert to just being able to speak what their primary language is, because that's what works better in their brain, right? So, quick question. What do y'all think the top 5 languages are that are spoken by the LEP population in Alabama? Rebecca's going to read out your answers for us. What are the top 5? I'm going to give you Spanish, okay? What else?
Aileen said Russian.
Russian, that's a good guess.
It is.
Come on, y'all, wake up, wake up.
Reggie said Mandarin. We also have Chinese, Arabic, Japanese or Mandarin. Ooh, coming in now. They woke up. Chinese, Arabic, French, Korean, ASL. That was a good one too.
Yeah.
French Creole, French. Oh, French Creole specifically. That's a good one. That's interesting. Quiche. Someone said Quiche.
Hey, Quiche, good job.
Tagalog, which I don't know if it's different than Tagalog.
Tagalog, yep.
Oh, yes.
From the Philippines.
Okay.
Very good. Y'all are
Portuguese,
awesome.
Mom, Hindu, Portuguese.
Okay, so I'm sure they're going to keep coming in. Y'all have got a really diverse idea of this. And this is the point of this slide and this question, is that I think a lot of us think about, and we're talking about the Latino population today, where the primary language would be Spanish. But we have many different other languages represented in Alabama. So here are the statistics from a couple of years ago. This may have shifted, but it gives you a basic idea. So the top 5 in the state of Alabama are Spanish, Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, and Arabic, right? So we got all of those listed. We've got several of the other ones y'all mentioned on this list as well. German, French, Gujarati. I'm sorry for the sign language interpreter. This is a lot of spelling. Tagalog, Hindi, Laotian, Russian, Portuguese, Turkish, and Japanese. So you notice I'm reading those out loud because for the sign language interpreter, you may need that, and for the Spanish interpreter, we need to make sure we're translating that into Spanish. So we may deal with different languages in different areas. So for instance, in the area I'm in the Montgomery area and South Alabama, Korean is very common. It would be the number 2 after Spanish. On the coast, Vietnamese is really common. So this may change depending on your area, right? I do want to flag, and I thank you so much for the people who said Mom and Quiche. Those are Mayan languages that come from Guatemala. And as we talked about yesterday, we have a very large Guatemalan population in the state. And so those are not listed here. I would argue, and part of that is because they're not tracked very well. And the folks who speak those languages tend to be the ones who are less likely to interact with the government, less likely to respond to surveys. And so these languages are very common, but they are not always tracked. So I would argue that up near the top, maybe even second, third, fourth, we have Guatemalan and Mexican languages, which I did mention yesterday. These are indigenous languages. They're not dialects of Spanish, and they are all distinct from each other. So it becomes very challenging, also because it's difficult to find interpreters in those languages, even sometimes on the phone interpreting services. So that just want to recognize that as languages that are very common, and that becomes a challenge when working with some of the Guatemalan and Mexican population. But it is important to not assume that folks speak Spanish just because they're Latino. Again, just because they can manage basic conversations in Spanish does not mean that's their first language. And sometimes it's really hard for folks to operate in Spanish, let alone English, right? So to give you the framework, when we talk about advocating for people who have limited English proficiency, we need to understand what the laws are. So if you're advocating and you're pushing for language access, whether it's within your own organization or with other agencies that you work with, or people that serve your clients, you need to know that you have backup, right? It's not just that we're asking for this because we want to serve people better, which should be a goal of everybody, right? We're not asking for this just because this particular person has requested it. We're asking for it because it's the law. So under the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, okay, this has been around for a long time. The language says, no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So to break that down a little bit, you see race and color, which we associate with the Civil Rights Act. We think about black and white. We think about the civil rights movement in the 60s. But also in there is national origin. And the courts have essentially said that based on, if you're not providing meaningful language access to people who speak limited English, you're discriminating based on national origin. So this is super important. This is our backup, right? This is what tells us that we have a reason beyond just the compassion to do this. And sometimes this is the argument that people need to hear, for better or for worse. So the next part that's really key is any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So Rebecca, and I'm going to ask you to do the chat again. Who do y'all think receives federal financial assistance? What agencies or programs in Alabama receive federal money?
Ooh, we got 2 DHRs immediately.
Yes.
Someone said schools. Someone said, and I'm going to remember to be slower this time. I'm sorry to the interpreters for last time. Someone said ALSDE.
Yep, that's the Alabama Department of Education. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Missy said victim services. We got nonprofits, hospital, State Department and schools, child advocacy centers. I didn't think about that, but very true.
Yeah.
Any other ideas, y'all?
Okay, so I'm going to name, y'all did a great job.
Someone also said police.
Yes,
Drug
thank
test.
you.
That was the one I wanted to,
Yep.
get. Thank you for that. Drug testing facilities, mental health. Someone said iglesia. Oh, church, right?
Church, yeah.
Court. Yeah, also true.
Okay, y'all have gotten, that's a really good list, right? So those are all the ones I would list. The only one I see that y'all left out was healthcare. So medical providers, anybody who receives or files for Medicare or Medicaid funds falls under this. And many hospitals and medical providers also receive federal money and grants. So pretty much everybody, this is the point of this, almost everybody falls under this law. That's going to mean everybody you work with that you refer to for your clients. DHR is a really good example. They are statewide. They work with a lot of different people. They work with all of these different agencies we just named, really, right? They're required. All the state agencies are required. And probably all of your nonprofits, right? The vast majority of our nonprofit organizations are receiving federal money. So there's the piece, right? And there are some other regulations within, and I'm not going to go into detail, but there's an executive order that came through a few years ago under the Joint Commission standards for hospitals, has a whole section about language access regulations. There's several of different places where there are regulations in place. They don't all have the teeth or the law. They're not always the law, right? But the Civil Rights Act is a very concrete law. So, why are we doing this? And I think everybody on this conference today is going to be on this page. So I don't have to go into very much detail about these particular reasons, right? We want everybody to access our services. We want to empower clients to tell their own story. And that's one of the things that we've talked about yesterday and today, is we want to empower folks, anybody we work with, to understand and participate in the process, right? To tell their own story, to have their own voice. And as advocates, we should always default to that, right? This is not something that we need to do for someone else. We need to empower them to understand their rights and access the services they need. It builds trust, right? And so within a community, and some of you may have seen this happen as you put language access into place. Once somebody realizes they can come into your agency and feel comfortable and communicate in their own language, they're going to come back, right? And then what's going to happen? They're going to tell everybody they know. And especially within the Latino community, with other foreign-born communities, within the deaf community, right? They're tight communities. And once somebody knows they're going to feel comfortable somewhere, they're going to recommend it to other people. And then the last thing is it helps you do your job, right? If you can't communicate, you can't do your job, which should be a very obvious thing, right? But I have encountered all sorts of situations where very highly educated, very intelligent people are not using language services, and they literally can't do their job, right? So an example, at some point as an interpreter, I was called into a cardiologist's office. They had done with a woman who was from Guatemala. Spanish was her second language. She was very young. She had very serious heart problems. And they had done the entire first appointment without an interpreter. All the testing, all the explaining to her the diagnosis, which was really not explaining to her, she understood nothing. And so we had to go back over all of that once we came into that second appointment. But on some level, it blows my mind, right? That highly intelligent, highly educated people don't use interpreters and do their jobs without having that communication. That is not a judgment. I have discovered that this is just a reality, right? We're human beings. And so some of the time it is that people have just never thought about it before. And maybe some folks who are in this conversation today have never thought about it before. That's okay. The idea of the advocacy is we need to meet people where they're at. No matter how, honestly, for me, it's infuriating sometimes. It's somewhat unbelievable. It is frustrating, but people are where they are, right? And so it's kind of that balancing act between recognizing that people are not doing what they should do and helping them get to that place where they need to be. So it's going to help you, and I'm going to skip this actually. It's going to help you do your job better. Not only having language access in your own agency, but pushing for language access in all the other agencies that you work with. So when we talk about language access, we don't want this to just be something that is checking a box. We don't want it to be something that just lives on a piece of paper and is never put into practice. So we add this word meaningful, and this is actually also part of what the government adds to their standards. And I will say that meaningful is a fairly subjective term, right? You might have a different idea of what that means than I do, but we can outline some of the basic pieces that we need in order to have meaningful access. The number one thing is provide services in multiple languages. And so we say the top 5. With some of the tools that we have now, we have video interpreting, which is awesome for sign language, right? We have phone interpreters, and I'm not going to get into the reasons why you might want to use an in-person interpreter instead, but we have all these tools at our disposal. The phone lines, usually you can get up to 200 languages, right? So you may say, we're definitely going to provide these particular services in these top 5 languages, but knowing that you're also going to put tools into place that can provide help with other languages. And this includes those indigenous languages. And I want to say, don't get overwhelmed by this because it's a process. If you don't have any of this in place, you start where you're at, right? And you move forward. So maybe, your priority is Spanish because that's the most common language you're seeing, but you need to move towards providing other languages as well. The other thing is services should be professional. We'll talk about that in a minute. High quality, free of charge, and there are people who charge folks for interpreters, and provided by the agency. So this is the key. Again, it is not appropriate to ask somebody to bring an interpreter with them. This is somewhat the standard, right? And what happens is it becomes this cycle, right? Because we say, oh, well, she brought somebody with her the last time. Or, oh, we were able to use the child to interpret last time. So we'll just keep doing that, right? Because it's easier, because it doesn't cost us any money. But we're going to talk a little more about what are the consequences of that happening. So the folks who have limited English automatically assume they have to bring somebody with them, which shouldn't be true. So it is this process for you to also notify people these services are available. You don't have to bring somebody with you. And our standard now is to use a neutral professional interpreter. So thank you so much for bringing somebody with you, but we're going to use this interpreter, and next time you don't have to bring anybody. Okay, so you have to kind of train and change everybody's perspective along the way. I will say the free of charge thing, many times people are paying somebody in the community to come with them to interpret. And myself, as a professional interpreter, I don't have a problem with that if that happens. But to be honest, the interpreter should also act as an advocate, in my opinion, in that situation. We're limited to how we can advocate. But what I tend to do is, if an individual contacts me, I will say, you know, I'm so glad you contacted me. I would love to take your money, but here's what I know. The court should provide you an interpreter. You don't need to pay me to go. So I'm willing to help you in this moment to contact the court and request the interpreter. Now, if I know the court and I work with that court, you can say, hey, I've already talked to Melissa and she's available, and they may assign me to that case, and then I'll get paid. As an interpreter, the risk is I don't end up getting that job, but in the end, it actually helps me, right? Because they are going to continue to use professional interpreters. It actually creates more work for me, right? So you have to think of this in the long term as creating the standards, as helping us all raise our level of service so that it is actually meaningful access. So the other piece is services should always be offered rather than as a default, rather than waiting for the client to make a request. Now, you're going to see as we talk a little more that that is not the case in many, many situations. The default is we're not going to provide this unless we get a request. The issue with that is many people don't want to feel like they're a burden. They don't want to cause problems. They're afraid somebody will say no, or they just assume they don't even have the right to request. And so it's important to advertise and promote and say to everybody, we will provide this, and make that question a default question when you're working with people that you think might have limited English. Every once in a while, you might say to somebody, I'll go back to Beverly from yesterday, right? She was born and raised here. She speaks perfect English. She doesn't need an interpreter. You may look at her and make the assumption she does. Every once in a while, you'll say, hey, do you speak English? Do you need an interpreter? Somebody might get a little offended. I don't think Beverly would get offended by that because she wants to know that you're providing that. You give that person the chance to say no or say yes, right? The other piece is that it needs to be timely assistance. And we see this over and over again, where somebody has an appointment scheduled. It may be a doctor or a specialist appointment that takes months to get on the schedule. It may be a court hearing that has been on the schedule for months or weeks, right? And nobody has taken the time to find out if that person needs an interpreter and provide one. So what happens? You go to the court hearing. Maybe it's a protection from abuse hearing, a PFA hearing. That person's life is at risk, right? Their safety is at risk. And you get to this hearing and they say, oh, sorry, we don't have an interpreter. We'll have to reschedule. And then it takes another month, right? This is a really bad practice. Okay, so it's not just, okay, we've got this on paper, we may provide it. It's that we need to be thinking ahead, right? And making sure that if we have an appointment that's scheduled a month ahead of time, that we go ahead as soon as we schedule the appointment and call the interpreting company or let our interpreter know that this appointment's going to happen, because there's nothing worse for interpreting agencies or interpreters to get called at 5 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. Oh my gosh, I need you at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. It's not fair, right? It doesn't work, right? Because I already have something scheduled for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And even agencies who have multiple interpreters to work with, that's a struggle and a scramble for people to have to make that happen so quickly. Now, if it's a true urgent situation, we're okay with that, right? Things happen, especially in victim services, with police, even with medical situations. You have to have some services in place that can be called at the last minute. But if you already have something on the schedule, it's important to think ahead about that. The last piece is a language access plan. So this is essentially a policy, a procedure that you put in place that says, here are the points of contact with the community. If somebody walks in the door, this is what we're going to do. These are the things we're going to do to inform the community that we have language services available. If someone calls us, if we have a written communication, these are the things we're going to do, and these are the resources we have to make that happen. And that you need to have multiple tools available within that plan. So one of the things that happens very often is that an organization, an agency has a bilingual person on staff. And I know all the bilingual people who work in organizations and agencies who are on this call will probably be jumping up and down and saying, yes, yes, yes to this, right? We have Melissa who speaks Spanish on staff. So we got it covered. Oh, that's our plan, right? Melissa is our entire plan. One person cannot serve everybody. What happens if Melissa is out sick? What happens if Melissa leaves, right? And then you have nothing, and you have this client coming in tomorrow that Melissa was supposed to interpret for, and she's no longer there. We have had several agencies call us in a panic. Oh my gosh, we had this staff person, she left, we don't know what to do. So it's a plan, it's a putting in place a number of different tools to be able to really meaningfully serve people.
Hey,
So
Melissa?
does anybody have any comments or questions? That's what is coming up for you, Rebecca, yeah?
Yeah, hey Melissa, this is Rebecca speaking. I just wanted to say that there was one question a little bit back. I didn't know when to cut you off though. Someone asked, really great question, how would you recommend navigating when the client slash patient prefers to have their family member slash friend interpret, even after offering to call a professional interpreter? And I will say that Sonia did also give her thoughts to be mindful of HIPAA should agencies, oh, sorry, different question. I'll ask you that after.
Okay, so the answer to that is you always go back to the policy. So if you have a policy in place, that's your excuse. It's not that we don't respect your wishes. It's not that we think that this person you brought is a bad person. This is our rule. And if you have the rule in place, you don't have any worries with that, right? Now, I will say, if you have a really brief interaction, somebody's making an appointment, somebody has what seems like a simple question, sometimes it's okay to use that person. But just keep in mind that what if the conversation ends up going into a lot of other things? You may not want that person involved. And we'll talk in a minute about why you shouldn't use, if possible, folks that somebody brings, unless you know that they're a professional interpreter. Now, again, this is kind of that idea that somebody might bring somebody and, hey, it's Melissa. You already know Melissa. She's worked with you before. I know that she has this training and this capacity. then maybe you might do that. But again, create the policy, use that as your reason. Oh, I'm so sorry. This is the rule. My boss said I have to do this. It's like, and you'd have no, it just is what it is, right? Now, I mean, somebody may really, really push you. In that case, you just have to make a decision if it's something really crucial. And I would say all communications are crucial, right? But if it's a medical appointment, if it's a counseling session, you just never know what that person's agenda is. You don't know what their skill level is. And so it just really is important to set those standards. That was kind of a long answer. I hope that helped.
There was a bit of a follow-up question. Someone also asked, to be mindful of HIPAA, should agencies have clients sign a waiver when they insist on having a family member / friend as an interpreter?
Yes. So there is actually standard paperwork out there. I don't have any examples of it, but I have seen it in different agencies, especially so when they start with the intake, they'll do just like you have to give permission to exchange information with other medical providers or with other agencies. Very often they'll have something that gives permission to use the professional interpreter or the interpreting company. There are also waivers that you can do in the moment that says, I'm not using the provided interpreter. I choose to use my own interpreter. I'm going to see if I can find some examples of those. But yeah, that would be the best way to kind of cover yourself with HIPAA, but also with, any other place, beyond medical that we're working with. Because again, like a lot of victim services, we have really strict confidentiality policies, right? So the answer to that question is yes.
Great answer. Thank you,
Anything
Melissa.
else? Okay, so we are going to go to our next session. So, and I could talk about this part all day long. Remind me, Rebecca, I have until 11:20.
Yes, ma'am. You have until 11:20.
Okay, thanks. So who should you use as an interpreter? We really, really recommend trained, certified, professional interpreters. Being bilingual is not the same as being an interpreter. This is super, super important to consider. And the reason why is actually, so there's an example that people use that I think is really awesome. If I have hands, that doesn't mean that I can play the piano like a professional, right? It seems really difficult. Everybody has hands. That doesn't mean that we're going to be able to do this really complicated thing with our hands, right? Just because you speak 2 languages doesn't mean you have the capacity to be an interpreter. And I will say there are many, many people out there in the world who want to help, have been interpreting for years without any training. It doesn't mean that they don't have some of the skills. What it means is they are not trained. They don't have the education. And interpreting and translation are professions. It's very difficult. You think about today, these interpreters we have, they're interpreting simultaneously. They're having to process that language, English or Spanish, and they are switching it over to the other language and spitting it out on the other side. It is a difficult job. And with training, you get the tools, you build your memory, you build your skills. And it's like any other profession. If we think about it this way, In Alabama, if you're going to be a hairstylist, you have to get a license. You go to school for that for the most part. If you are an electrician, if you are a doctor or a nurse or any other professional, you go to school for it, right? You learn, you get the skills before you just get thrown into it. And I would say many people who are bilingual get thrown into it. That's how we start, right? They say, oh, hey, you speak Spanish, come on over here and help. It's dangerous. It's dangerous for us. There's a liability there for you. And it's really a disservice, right, when we do that. So one of the things that we're really working on with the Language Access Coalition, with the Interpreters Association, with the organizations that are dedicated to language access, is helping interpreters get trained and certified. There are quite a bit of resources and training and degrees available for sign language interpreters. That is not true, especially in Alabama, for spoken language interpreters. So we do really have, we do not have the capacity that we need to always provide folks who have training, have schooling, have certification. So that's another way you can help advocate. If you have somebody on staff or you yourself are a bilingual staff person who is asked to do this, put the resources into helping that person get trained or certified. And I'm not going to get into all the details of what certification is, but at the very least, somebody should have some basic education on how to do their job. So you want somebody who has that training on ethics. We do have a code of ethics. We have to be accurate. We have to be impartial. We have to maintain confidentiality. And then there's a number of other pieces to our codes of ethics. But we do have that, right? And so very often people who are not professionals will go outside of those boundaries. You want somebody who's familiar with the subject matter. And for those of us who are victim services providers that have this context of how to work with survivors and people who are dealing with trauma. An example, you don't want to just pull somebody who may be a great medical interpreter into a court situation. It's a whole nother world. It's a whole nother set of vocabulary. Even, I got kind of thrown into interpreting for DHR for a number of years for children's advocacy centers, forensic interviews. I didn't have any context. DHR and special education school system stuff is some of the hardest interpreting I've done because y'all have your own vocabulary. There's a million acronyms. There's a really complicated process with all these steps. So you want somebody who knows that subject matter. And if you call an interpreter and they say, I don't feel comfortable because I'm not familiar with this situation. One thing you can do is help them get familiar, right? Walk them through some of the vocabulary, help them get oriented to the process, who's involved, why you do things the way you do. What does the intake paperwork look like, right? So you can help interpreters get familiar because on some level, in order to get that information, you have to do it, right? But you really want to make sure that you have somebody who has that context. The last piece is please, please, please do not use children. Y'all tell me in the chat, why should we not use a child as an interpreter or to translate written word? What are the risks we take when we use a child? What are the issues that might come up?
So this is Rebecca. Someone in the chat said that it could be traumatizing. Someone said they'd be too young to understand. Aileen said trauma and liability. Heather said the client might not provide all the needed information. Very true. I know one thing I've heard Melissa talk about is, a parent's not going to want to protect their child from traumatic information. Someone said the child cannot interpret because they don't properly understand. And yeah, someone also said they don't have the emotional maturity. They may not know the words well enough to be accurate. Someone also said divided loyalties, miscommunication, sensitive issues might be discussed. Someone also said it's unethical. And then Heather also said it's a burden on the child.
Oh my gosh, y'all are awesome.
Right?
Y'all could just give my whole presentation for me. That is all right. Those are all the right answers. And as service providers, as social workers, as counselors, professionals, we know these dynamics, right? It's just about thinking that through. A child might not know the vocabulary. A child may not want to. It's very uncomfortable to be in a medical, gynecological appointment with your mom. Their mom has been raped or victimized, maybe by their dad, right? And somebody said loyalty, right? So they may be siding or not understanding the full context, not knowing, because many times in DV situations, the parents hide from the children what's going on, right? To protect them. So they may not even know what's going on. They may have judgment about that. Trauma, you may complicate their trauma. And on a family dynamic level, it shifts the power, right? So it actually, the child now has the power in the situation. The child is taking on an adult role and adult responsibility. And that can cause all sorts of consequences within the family structure, right? So don't use the kids. Again, to make an appointment, a quick phone call, maybe, right? But it's really not a good idea in general. Why would we not use family and friends? We already sort of talked about this, or whoever somebody walks in the door with. Why would we not use those people as interpreters?
Chelsea said, oh, sorry, this is Rebecca speaking. Chelsea said they could have their own agenda and misrepresent. Someone also said privacy. Someone said not reliable, could have hidden agenda, confidentiality. Someone also said, sorry, I'll slow down a bit. Someone also said risk of inaccuracy too. Heather said, we don't know if they're the offender.
You never, ever know who that person is, what their agenda is, how they're involved in that situation. There may not be an agenda. There may not be an issue. And I put on here, do not use the abuser. This happens, right? It happens consciously. It happens without realizing it. So let's say a police officer shows up at a scene where something's going on. They don't have any idea who those bystanders are. They may say, oh, somebody walks up and says, oh, I speak English. You don't know if that's the person who caused the problem, or is the abuser, or a friend of the abuser, or you never know, right? And even somebody who has a good intention coming in may have a side, right? They may be on the side of this person they're interpreting for. And so they may try and advise that person. They may try and influence the situation in what is seen as a positive way. But again, that's disempowering to the person you're working with. And it may change the outcome. So thank y'all so much. I think so many of you get this, right? But it's useful to review. So
I'll just say, Melissa, someone
Yes.
did say in the chat that it had happened with a person they interpreted for. The offender being used as an interpreter.
Yeah. It happens in court, y'all. It happens. I mean, I'm going to tell you, there's some atrocious stuff going on around this. And I say what I mean with this. And I just want to say this reality that some of us work within agencies that are not doing the job that they're supposed to do. Some of us see this all the time, right? We've got to make a change with this. So this is the point. Here's why we're here. Y'all have that background. You have the understanding. You know what you're advocating for. Okay. You now somewhat understand what the rights of your clients are and why we need to advocate for this. But the number one thing we need to do as advocates is walk the talk, right? We have to have language access plans ourselves within our own agencies. As employees of an agency or an organization, ask for your language access plan and the tools that you need. I will say, if you work with DHR has a language access plan, and they have a company that they use for interpreting and translation. And I'm not sure why, but sometimes that information doesn't get communicated to the workers. So if you haven't been provided that information, ask for it. There are other agencies that also have these plans and resources in place. But if they've never been offered to you, ask. If the answer is we don't have this, advocate for this within your own organization. And I know sometimes this is delicate. Maybe you feel like you're not in a decision-making role. Maybe you're not, right? But bring these stories to your supervisor, to your director, and say, I've been really frustrated by this. I can't do my job well. We're just doing a disservice to this client. This is the result of what happened because we didn't have this in place. And I've learned, even though I want to take this stance, it's not necessarily useful a lot of the time to come in with the stick, right? It's not helpful to go in with a tone of, you're not doing this correctly, and I'm going to file a complaint immediately, and this is not working. It's confrontational. It immediately puts people on the defensive. So you have to start with the kindness, with this is really not okay, but I'm going to meet you where you're at, right? It's difficult to do, especially if you're repeatedly frustrated, but you have to start there. So ask your leadership. If you're in leadership, make an effort to improve your services. The last thing I want to say on this piece is AshaKiran, we are starting some projects where we are assisting with creation of language access plans. So again, there are templates, there are tools that already exist. You're not having to reinvent the wheel. You can create a plan in a way that is standard and is not overwhelming, because we can help you walk through the steps with that. The second piece is help people request language services. And so this is going outside of your agency, right? So obviously within your agency, but when you're referring somebody out, when you're helping somebody get access to other resources, inevitably, if you haven't already, you're going to run into somebody who doesn't have this in place. In fact, in my experience, the majority of agencies and organizations do not have language access in place. So you have to request. So number one, again, we go back to empowering, giving that person a voice. Encourage your clients to request language services. So this may mean, okay, as an agency, I'm a person who speaks Spanish, and so I'm going to help this person communicate, because even the request sometimes has to be made in English, which is this like constant cycle, right? I want to ask for this, and somebody says, oh, you can request it, but how do I request it if I can't communicate my request, right? So you may have to help. Maybe you have an interpreting phone line, and so you put somebody on a three-way call. The client says to whoever answers the phone, my name is so-and-so, I have this appointment, I want to request an interpreter, and that interpreter helps them communicate that, right? You may have to inform them of their rights. You may have to assist some, but again, try and default to helping that person do it themselves rather than doing it for them. Now that person may feel uncomfortable. They may not, want to make the call for them with them sitting in the room, whatever you need to do, right? But make sure they know this is their right to request an interpreter. And ask your partner organizations. So you can do this in a proactive way. You can say, I know we have a relationship with this mental health agency and that we refer people frequently to this agency. Before that person who's LEP walks into your door and needs that service, go and ask your partner organization, do y'all have this available? If they don't have it available, encourage them, give them the resources, say to them, as an agency, we are dealing with people who have limited English. We need our partners to provide this, because what's going to happen if we send somebody your way? We want them to be able to get the services they need. And again, you can refer folks to us. You can refer folks to other agencies that you may know of who provide language services. You can, once you get your language access plan, share that with them. Say, we just went through this process. We have this great language access plan. We're willing to share it with you. This is how it worked. Does anybody have any questions about that piece? Or these last two pieces?
This isn't a question, but it's just a comment that I wanted to read out to you.
Mm-hmm.
Lucia, who I believe, if I'm remembering from earlier, is with the attorney's office in Jefferson County. She said, at our agency, it is a right to have a certified interpreter for any court case we have. The court will pay for it. I'm pretty positive that is throughout the state. And I'm not positive what her agency is, so that it might not actually be the district attorneys.
Yes, awesome transition, because that's what I'm about to get to. So there's a particular problem within the court system, and I will say thank you for mentioning that, because some courts, some attorneys, some judges are doing a decent job of this. You're right, this is a statewide requirement. There are regulations under the Alabama Office of Courts. So that's actually the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court manages that, that's the office under that person. And they're the ones who manage the interpreting program. I will say, and I'm going to just freely say this out loud, the AOC is not doing what they should be doing to promote and encourage language services in the state of Alabama in the court system. They have very limited resources put towards it. The exams for certified interpreters are not being offered often anymore. There's not a lot of education for judges and court personnel on how to do this process. So we need to advocate for more resources on the state level to be put into this. And we may also need to advocate just with our local judges, with our local, victim services officers, or the DA's office, or, other places. And those of you who are practicing this well, offer this information to your colleagues in other counties or other areas, right? But so what's happening is this is falling to advocates, it's falling to people who are doing it right in certain areas, it's falling to the interpreters themselves to advocate for this proper procedure. I have hope that this will improve. This is one of the major projects that the New Language Access Coalition is going to undertake, is trying to work with them and work with other agencies to improve the situation, to get more court interpreters certified in the state. Because I will say, with the court system at this point, there are less than a dozen fully certified court interpreters in the state of Alabama in Spanish. And we have, I think, maybe one or two others certified in other languages that actually I don't think are physically in Alabama. They're from other states. So we want to say, okay, we want to use certified interpreters, but we don't have the certified interpreters. And I'm speaking again of spoken languages, right? There is better capacity with ASL interpreters, but we don't have enough. I know that for sure, right? So we're doing this balance. We have to help build the capacity of the interpreters, and we have to push the courts to do what they're supposed to do. So interpreters by law in the state of Alabama should be provided for all criminal cases, all juvenile cases, and in civil court protection from abuse hearings. So those of you who are victim services advocates, many people don't know that this is true. So any PFA hearings, you have a right to a court appointed and paid interpreter. We do not provide interpreters for civil cases. So that means divorce, custody, other civil proceedings. Now that technically should be happening, but at this point it's not. So if you, and I realize I'm getting close to my time, I recognize that. I'm going to try and get through this. So one thing we recommend, and this is something also that HICA has been helping with, is make a verbal request for the interpreter, but then also attach a written request to any paperwork or application. So for instance, if you are applying for a protection from abuse order, attach a document to that request that says, I am requesting it. I speak Spanish. I'm requesting an interpreter for my hearing and procedure, whatever the process is, right? And we want to do this because we want to track that these requests are happening, right? So you can come back and say this request was made in writing to the court or to this agency. If services are not provided, so, and I skipped to file a complaint, but again, if you have a relationship, have that conversation, right? Don't skip immediately to the complaints, but if you get to the point where there's a conversation and they're not still doing what they need to do, you can file a complaint with the Alabama Office of Courts, with the Department of Justice, and I will send y'all in an email all these links and information about how to do this. And also with the New Language Access Coalition, we're developing a complaint form. You want to record the date, the time, the case number, the name if you can, the language, and a record of the fact that you made a written request, right? If you don't have all of this, that's okay. But the date and the case number, something that identifies, okay, I didn't just say, like, I went into this court on Tuesday morning and they didn't give an interpreter. They need to have something a little more concrete. The client can file a complaint, which is always the ideal thing. But you can also file on behalf of the client. And in most situations, the complaint can be anonymous. So again, if we don't continue to advocate for this, it's not going to change. If we don't make a record of what's happening or not happening, it doesn't, like, we can't prove that to anybody, right? And move forward and create better standards. Here's my last piece, and this is very similar with any other service providers. Again, anybody who receives federal money has to do this. The agency should not ask the client to bring an interpreter. So if you see that that's happening, if you call to help make an appointment at mental health, for instance, and you say, this person speaks Spanish, how do y'all deal with this? And they say, well, they need to bring their own interpreter. Politely inquire and make that verbal request. This person or the person themselves says, I'm requesting an interpreter. I'm not going to bring an interpreter. If they come back and say, sorry, we just don't do this, provide examples, make a written request again, ask maybe to move up the chain, because there may be bureaucracy involved. We have to have some compassion, and we have to recognize what the situations are. And if there's still no response, you can file the complaints, right? And I know that sometimes this is delicate because we want to maintain our relationships with the judges, with the DA, with the healthcare provider, we have these relationships with these organizations. But at some point, y'all, as advocates, we have to prioritize taking care of our clients and our own work, right? And so it may not be perfect. It may feel a little confrontational, but we have to push people in this direction, right? Okay, really quick, AshaKiran does have a language access program. Some of y'all I know already use our services. We provide free language services to any organization that serves victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking. So if you fall within those categories, your clients are experiencing those issues, contact us. We can get a memorandum of understanding set up, and we can get you access to those resources. So that's me for today. I'm 2 minutes over. I don't know if we want to take 2 more minutes for questions or comments. Here is my direct contact information. Please call, email. We're happy to, even if it's just a specific situation or an overall language access question. I'm happy to help, and our staff is happy to help. I'm sorry, Mojde, I got in a hurry, and I, as an interpreter, still sped up for you. All right, any quick question or comment?